Everyone talks about power like it's something you can see, kings, armies, the guy in the suit who fires you. But one French philosopher saw what nobody else could see. Michel Foucault watched people police themselves without anyone watching. He saw control that worked by making you think you wanted it. He mapped power that flows through your morning routine, your doctor's office, your kid's classroom, and you never even knew it was there. You think you're free. You think your thoughts are yours. But what if the deepest control isn't the boot on your neck? What if it's the voice in your head telling you what normal means? Torches light the corridor. A man rushes past the guards. He keeps his hat on. That's the mistake. You take your hat off before the king. Robert François Damiens, 42 years old, born in Arras, former domestic servant. He thrusts a small knife into the king's side. The king grabs his ribs, thinks he's been elbowed. His hand comes back covered in blood. Guards seize Damiens immediately. The would-be assassin had worked for councillors in the Parlement, men who criticized the king constantly, who spoke against the Marquise de Pompadour. Damiens absorbed it all, became fanatical, thought he was saving France. Start with the boots, compression devices that crush his legs, then red-hot pincers tear flesh from his breasts, his arms, his thighs, his calves. They burn his right hand with sulfur, the hand that held the knife. Molten wax poured into the wounds, molten lead, boiling oil. The crowd watches, thousands. Giacomo Casanova rents a window overlooking the square with friends and female companions. They watch for 4 hours. Damien screams. Doesn't curse, doesn't swear, just screams and begs. Pardon my God, pardon my Lord. They attach ropes to his limbs, harness 4 horses, 1 to each arm, 1 to each leg. The horses pull. Damiens doesn't separate. His limbs don't tear. The executioner is Charles-Henri Sanson, the man who will later execute Louis XVI. Irony thick as blood. Sanson cuts the tendons. Now the horses can finish. They rip Damiens apart. The crowd applauds. His torso still lives, still moves. His jaw clenches like he wants to speak. They throw what's left onto the stake, burn it, grind the ashes, scatter them in the wind. His house razed, his family forced to change their names. His father, wife, daughter banished from France. This is sovereign power, visible, theatrical. The body destroyed as spectacle to show everyone what happens when you touch the king. If you value documented philosophy and social theory history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, published in 2003, updated regularly through 2025, and from Michel Foucault's own lectures at the Collège de France, archived and published posthumously starting in 1997, particularly his lectures entitled Society Must Be Defended, from 1975 to 76, and Security, Territory, Population, from 1977 to 78, both of which lay out his theories of biopower and disciplinary mechanisms with specific historical examples, cross-referenced against 18th and 19th century French administrative documents. Now back to the information. At 6, drum roll. The prisoners move to the chapel for morning prayer. At 6:15, they work, each man in his designated station. At 8:45, they pause. The supervisor reads the day's orders. Work resumes at 9. At 12, they form ranks, march to the refectory. The meal? Silence. One prisoner reads aloud from an approved text. At 12:40, they work again. At 6:55, work stops, bread distributed. The prisoners scatter to cells for reading. At 7:45, bed. Lights out. No more burning flesh in public squares. No more horses pulling bodies apart. No more sovereign spectacle. Just timetables, cells, supervisors, silence, work, prayer, sleep. Repeat. Michel Foucault opens his book, Discipline and Punish, with these 2 scenes side by side. Damiens torn apart. The timetable, published in 1775 in France. Surveiller et punir. Naissance de la prison. Translated into English in 1977. Birth of the prison. The question Foucault asks isn't which system is more humane. The question is what changed? How did power shift from destroying your body in public to organizing your soul in private? And why does that matter more than you think? Grandson of a surgeon, they wanted him to study medicine. He refused. Enrolled at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris in 1946. Studied philosophy and psychology. Brilliant but tormented. Read voraciously. Martin Heidegger, Friedrich Nietzsche, Georges Bataille. Joined the Communist Party in 1950. Left in 1953. Disillusioned by Stalinist anti-Semitism. Taught in Sweden, Poland, Germany through the late 50s. Returned to France in 1960. University of Clermont-Ferrand, published Madness and Civilization in 1961, The Birth of the Clinic in 1963, The Order of Things in 1966, bestseller, fame, controversy, moved to Tunisia, returned for the May 1968 protests, students and workers against the state, riot police, tear gas, barricades. Foucault in the streets, appointed to the Collège de France in 1970, professor of History of Systems of Thought, a title created specifically for him, because his work didn't fit anywhere. Not quite philosophy, not quite history, not quite sociology. Something new, published Discipline and Punish in 1975, The History of Sexuality, Volume 1 in 1976, lectured constantly, traveled. Berkeley, Brazil, Japan, political activism, founded the Groupe d'Information sur les Prisons, investigated prison conditions, protested on behalf of marginalized groups. Homosexual, open, defiant, diagnosed with HIV in 1984, died June 25th, 1984, Paris, 57 years old, one of the most influential intellectuals of the 20th century, the man who changed how we see power. Most people think power is something the strong have and the weak don't. A king has power, a slave doesn't, a boss has power, a worker doesn't. This is what Foucault calls sovereign power, the right to take life or let live, the sword, the crown, the throne, top-down, hierarchical, visible. You see it coming. But Foucault argues that in the 17th and 18th centuries, something fundamental shifted. A new kind of power emerged, not replacing sovereign power entirely, supplementing it, infiltrating it, transforming it from within. This new power doesn't come from above. It doesn't sit in a palace. It doesn't wear a uniform. It circulates. It flows. It operates everywhere and nowhere. Foucault calls it disciplinary power, and it works completely differently. An English philosopher named Jeremy Bentham publishes drawings for a new prison design. He calls it the panopticon, from the Greek, panopts, all-seeing. The design is simple but revolutionary. A circular building, cells around the perimeter. Each cell faces inward. In the center, a watchtower. Guards in the tower can see into every cell, but the prisoners can't see the guards. Windows covered, blinds, shutters. The prisoner never knows if he's being watched at any given moment, but he knows he could be watched. At any moment, always. The architecture forces the prisoner to behave as if he's under constant observation, even when nobody's watching. The prisoner becomes his own guard, self-regulation, self-discipline, self-surveillance. Bentham spent 10 years trying to convince the British Parliament to build his panopticon, failed, died bitter. Convinced the king and the aristocracy rejected him and his principles. But the idea spread. Prisons in Illinois, Cuba, the Netherlands, Arnhem in 1882 to 86, Breda in 1883 to 85, Harlem in 1898 to 1901, all still in use, all based on Bentham's design. But here's what matters. Foucault sees the panopticon as more than prison architecture. He sees it as a metaphor, a diagram of modern power itself. You measure it, categorize it, compare it against standards, create norms, identify deviations, correct them. This is disciplinary power. It targets the body directly, makes it useful, makes it docile, integrates it into the economic system. Industrial capitalism needed bodies that could work long hours in factories, sit still at desks, follow schedules, obey commands, repeat tasks with precision. The old sovereign power couldn't do this. Public torture might scare people, but it doesn't teach them to sit quietly for 10 hours making the same motion. Disciplinary power does that, through training, through architecture, through timetables and exercises and hierarchical observation and normalizing judgment. Soldiers no longer just appear when the Lord summons them. They're trained, drilled, their movements standardized, their posture corrected, their aim improved through exercises. Schools multiply, children arranged in rows, facing forward, hands folded, silence. Lessons divided into units, progress measured, examinations, rankings, reports. The factory system develops, workers at stations, each task timed, movements observed, efficiency measured. Wages tied to output, hospitals reorganize, patients in beds, arranged by disease type, symptoms recorded, temperatures taken, charts maintained, treatments standardized, prisons transform from places of temporary detention before public punishment to institutions of reform, cells, labor, supervision. Time served as the punishment itself. The goal isn't revenge anymore, it's normalization, making the criminal conform to society's standards, teaching him to regulate himself. Data, knowledge about individuals. This knowledge becomes power, because now the institution can track you, compare you to others, identify where you deviate from the norm, target interventions. And the beautiful thing, from power's perspective, is that you accept this, you internalize it. Students compete for grades, workers compete for promotions, patients want to be declared healthy, prisoners want to be judged reformed. Everyone wants to be normal. Nobody wants to be the deviation, the exception, the problem case. So you discipline yourself, you monitor your own behavior, you adjust, you conform, without anyone forcing you. That's the genius of disciplinary power. Not the individual body, the population, the species. Starting in the late 18th century, Foucault argues, European states began to see populations as biological entities that could be managed, measured, optimized, birth rates tracked, death rates calculated, disease patterns mapped, life expectancy computed, immigration flows monitored. This wasn't possible before. You needed new tools, statistics, demography, political economy. These sciences emerged in the 18th century specifically to make populations visible as objects of knowledge and intervention. Once you have the data, you can govern differently, not just punishing individual crimes, managing collective health, promoting fertility, reducing mortality, controlling epidemics, maximizing productivity. This is biopower, the power to make life, to manage life processes, to foster life, but also, crucially, to let die, to decide whose life matters, whose life is worth preserving, whose can be sacrificed. Power over life itself, anatomopolitics of the body and biopolitics of the population. These two forms merge in the 19th century into a coherent technology of power. Sexuality becomes a key site where they intersect. It's individual, your body, your desires, but it's also collective. Reproduction, birth rates, heredity, population health. So sexuality becomes intensely regulated, not repressed. That's Foucault's big argument in The History of Sexuality. The Victorian era didn't repress sex, it made people talk about it constantly. In medical consultations, psychiatric sessions, confessionals, educational programs, moral treatises, scientific studies, all this discourse produced knowledge about sex, categories, normal and abnormal, healthy and pathological, heterosexual and deviant. This knowledge became power. Power to classify people, to intervene in their lives, to correct them, to normalize them. And every exercise of power relies on forms of knowledge to function. The prison creates the category of the delinquent through its examinations and classifications. Medicine creates the concept of the abnormal patient through its diagnostic criteria. Psychiatry creates the notion of the deviant through its symptom catalogs. Education creates the idea of the failing student through its grading systems. These aren't just neutral descriptions of reality, they're productions of power knowledge. They make certain types of subjects possible. They make certain interventions thinkable. They make certain forms of control acceptable. It's not concentrated in a sovereign who can be overthrown. It's diffused throughout the social body. It operates through countless micromechanisms. The teacher correcting posture, the doctor recommending a treatment, the supervisor timing a task, the parent enforcing bedtime, the individual monitoring their own weight, their own productivity, their own normality. Power circulates through all these practices, through architecture, through bureaucracy, through expertise, through norms and standards and procedures. It produces subjects who want to conform, who police themselves, who experience their self-discipline as freedom. This analysis comes from Foucault's own writings and lectures, particularly Discipline and Punish, published by Gallimard in 1975. His lecture series, Security, Territory, Population, from 1977 to 78, where he explicitly outlines biopower's emergence through 18th century demographic science and population management techniques, and contemporary scholarly analysis, including articles from journals like Social Theory and Health, published in March 2022, examining how Foucault's periodization has been both adopted and critically re-examined by modern sociologists and historians of medicine. Back to how this transforms everything. And you have state apparatuses that manage populations, public health departments, census bureaus, statistical offices, immigration services, welfare systems. Both produce knowledge, both exercise control, both shape what counts as normal. Together they create what Foucault calls a disciplinary society. Not a dystopia, not obviously oppressive, just thoroughly organized, thoroughly monitored, thoroughly normalized. People go to school, learn to sit still, follow schedules, complete assignments, get ranked, then they go to work, clock in, perform tasks, get evaluated, get promoted or demoted. They go to the doctor, get weighed, get measured, get diagnosed, get treated. They manage their households, budget their time, monitor their children's development, optimize their health, maximize their efficiency. All of this feels natural, normal, maybe even empowering. You're taking control of your life, improving yourself, being responsible. But Foucault asks, what makes these particular ways of living seem natural, Why does it feel wrong not to be productive, not to be healthy, not to be normal? Who decided what normal means? And how does that decision function as a form of power? Christianity made people confess their sins to priests, examine their conscience, speak their innermost thoughts and desires. This practice gets secularized in the 18th and 19th centuries. Now you confess to doctors, psychiatrists, teachers, social workers, therapists, researchers, pollsters. You reveal your sexual history, your emotional state, your fantasies, your anxieties, your habits, your failures. All this information gets recorded, becomes data, gets analyzed, produces knowledge. Knowledge about what's normal, what's deviant, what needs correction. And once you've confessed, once you've been categorized, you accept the category, you identify with it, you become the subject that the power knowledge system needs you to be. The homosexual, the neurotic, the delinquent, the underachiever, the addict. These aren't just descriptive labels. They're productions of disciplinary power. They create the very subjects they claim to discover. Standards that serve systems you can't see. You think you're just living your life, making choices, being yourself. But Foucault shows how even your sense of self is constructed through power relations, your identity, your desires, your sense of what's normal and abnormal, what's possible and impossible, what's desirable and shameful, all shaped by disciplinary mechanisms and biopolitical strategies that operate below the level of conscious thought. When the norms are so deeply embedded that they feel like nature, when the surveillance is so complete that you don't even notice it anymore, you just act as if you're always being watched, because, in a sense, you are, not by a specific person, but by the system itself, the network of power-knowledge relations that constitutes modern society. That he sees power everywhere and resistance nowhere. But that's not quite right. Foucault absolutely believes in resistance. He says power and resistance are inseparable. Wherever there's power, there's resistance. Because power isn't total. It's not a closed system. It works through practices and relationships that can always be contested, refused, transformed. The point isn't that we're helplessly trapped. The point is that we need to understand how power actually operates if we want to resist it effectively. You can't fight what you can't see. And most power in modern societies is invisible. It's in the architecture, the procedures, the expertise, the norms, the categories, the knowledge systems. Foucault's project is to make that visible, to show how what seems natural and inevitable is actually historical and contingent, to denaturalize the present, to open up the possibility of thinking and living differently. Failed suicides, heretics, prostitutes, anyone socially unproductive or disruptive. Foucault calls this the Great Confinement. Institutions sprouted across Europe to house these populations, remove them from sight. Later, in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, medicine claimed madness as its domain. Psychiatric expertise emerged. Asylums replaced houses of confinement. But the goal remained the same: normalization. Making the mad conform to standards of reason, not through chains anymore, through treatment, observation, moral management, the creation of docile, productive subjects. What changed wasn't the brutality disappearing. What changed was power becoming more efficient, more thorough, more invisible. The asylum looks more humane than the dungeon, but Foucault argues it's just a different technology of control. One that works by producing knowledge about the patient, by creating the category of mental illness, by making people identify with diagnostic labels, by turning resistance into symptoms that require more treatment. But Foucault argues the opposite. The 19th century didn't repress sex. It exploded with discourse about sex, medical texts, psychiatric studies, educational programs, moral campaigns, legal debates, literary works, all talking about sex constantly. This discourse didn't liberate. It produced new forms of control, new categories. The homosexual emerged as a distinct type of person in the late 19th century. Not someone who engaged in same-sex acts, a specific kind of being, with a psychology, a biology, a pathology. Once the category exists, it can be studied, regulated, corrected. The same with other sexual identities and practices. Perversion, deviation, abnormality, all defined through medical and psychiatric discourse, all subjects of intervention. The 20th century's supposed liberation doesn't escape this, it just shifts the terms. Now you must discover your true sexual self, express your authentic desires. This feels like freedom. But Foucault asks, who decides what counts as authentic? What determines which desires are healthy? What makes self-expression the measure of a good life? These norms didn't come from nowhere. They're produced through power knowledge systems. They shape how you understand yourself, what you want, what you pursue. You think you're just being yourself, but yourself is constructed through mechanisms you never questioned. Sometimes lenient, no clear rules, no systematic application. Reformers wanted power to be evenly distributed, codified, rationalized. They wanted punishment that fit the crime, that reformed the criminal, that protected society. Prison emerged as the perfect solution, not because it's less violent, but because it's more organized, more total. It operates on time, days served, months, years. It operates on the soul, rehabilitation programs, psychological evaluations, behavior modification. It produces knowledge, records, files, histories. It creates subjects, the delinquent, the recidivist, the rehabilitated offender. These categories didn't exist before. The prison created them through its operations. And here's the twist. Prison doesn't reduce crime. Never has. Recidivism rates have been known since the 19th century. Most prisoners reoffend. But the prison persists. Why? Foucault argues because its real function isn't to eliminate crime. It's to produce delinquency as a manageable population. Crime is diffuse, unpredictable. Anyone could be a criminal, but delinquency is specific, identifiable, track-able. The prison creates the delinquent class. Then society can justify surveillance, policing, control, all in the name of managing this dangerous population that the prison itself produces. This logic extends everywhere. Education creates the category of the failing student, then justifies remedial programs, more testing, more monitoring. Medicine creates the category of the at-risk patient, then justifies preventive interventions, screening programs, lifestyle modifications. Psychiatry creates the category of the disordered individual, then justifies treatment, medication, therapy. In each case, the institution produces the problem it claims to solve, not through conspiracy, through the normal operations of power knowledge, through classification systems, diagnostic criteria, standards, and norms. These create categories of people who need intervention. And once the categories exist, they seem natural, obvious. Of course, there are failing students. Of course, there are at-risk patients. Of course, there are disordered individuals. But Foucault shows these are historical productions. They could be different. They have been different. They will be different. When you do genealogy, you don't ask what something really is. You ask how it came to be, how it was contested, what alternatives were suppressed, what interests it served. Take the concept of the individual. Modern Western societies treat individuality as natural, fundamental, the basis of rights, freedom, identity. But Foucault shows the individual is a historical production. It emerged through disciplinary practices, examination, documentation, classification, the creation of case files, personal histories, individual trajectories. Before this, people weren't individuals in the modern sense. They were members of families, estates, guilds, corps. Their identity was collective. But disciplinary power needed to target bodies individually, to train them, measure them, correct them. So the individual was produced as object of knowledge, as subject of power. And now we can't imagine life without it. We think our individuality is our essence. But Foucault shows it's an effect of power. He doesn't believe in a true self waiting to be liberated. That's the humanist myth. He thinks we're always already constituted by power. There's no outside, no position of pure autonomy. But that doesn't mean we're helpless, because power isn't total, it's relational. It works through practices. Practices can be resisted, transformed, refused. The norms can be questioned, the categories can be rejected, new ways of living can be invented. Not by discovering your true self, but by creating yourself differently, by practicing what Foucault calls arts of existence, ways of shaping your life, your conduct, your pleasures, your relationships, not according to imposed norms, but according to your own ethical work on yourself. But as self-cultivation, care of the self, techniques for living well, practices of freedom, not freedom from power, that's impossible, but freedom within power. Freedom as the ability to refuse certain forms of subjection, to create new possibilities, to live otherwise. Foucault died before completing this project. The fourth volume of The History of Sexuality was published posthumously in 2018. Les Aveux de la Chair, Confessions of the Flesh, his analysis of Christian sexuality, how Christianity transformed ancient techniques of self-cultivation into practices of renunciation, how it made the self an object of endless scrutiny, how it tied truth to confession, to exposing your innermost being to authority. This became the template for modern forms of subjection. The human sciences, psychiatry, criminology, sexology, all demand that you speak your truth. Confess your desires, reveal your depths, all in the name of knowing yourself, freeing yourself. But Foucault shows this is just another form of power, one that works by making you produce yourself as object of knowledge. Once you see how power operates, once you understand that norms are constructed, that categories are historical, that the self is produced, Then you can start to think about living differently, not by discovering your true nature, but by experimenting with new ways of being, by refusing certain identities, certain practices, certain norms, by creating, as Foucault says, a work of art of your life, not following rules, but inventing rules. Aesthetic ethics, the self is perpetual creation. These aren't comfortable thoughts. They're destabilizing. They challenge everything we take for granted about autonomy, identity, freedom, progress. But maybe that's exactly what we need. Not reassurance, but disturbance. Not answers, but provocations. Power knowledge, discourse, biopower, discipline, governmentality, normalization. Some use them faithfully, some distort them, some reject them entirely, but nobody ignores them. You can't do serious work on power anymore without engaging Foucault. Even his critics have to contend with his insights. That power is productive, not just repressive. That it operates through knowledge, not just violence. That it works by shaping subjects, not just constraining them. That resistance requires understanding power's mechanisms, not just opposing its effects. He supported immigrant rights, gay rights, prison reform, psychiatric patients' rights. He traveled to Iran in 1978 to witness the Islamic Revolution, complicated, controversial. He later regretted some of his statements, but he was there, trying to understand, to witness, to support struggles against oppression. He gave public lectures, wrote op-eds, signed petitions, spoke at demonstrations, used his platform, his fame, his position, to amplify marginalized voices, to challenge institutional power, to make visible what authority wanted hidden. The point is to make power visible, to enable resistance, to open possibilities. His books aren't meant to be scripture. They're meant to be used, tested, pushed, broken, rebuilt, whatever helps people fight the forms of power they face. Before predictive policing, before the quantified self, before platform capitalism, before surveillance capitalism. But his analysis applies more than ever. The panopticon is everywhere now. Your phone tracks your location, your search history, your social connections, your purchasing patterns, your biometric data. Algorithms predict your behavior, recommend your content, shape your feed, nudge your choices. You're constantly examined, constantly documented, constantly compared to norms derived from massive data sets. You internalize this, you curate your profile, optimize your metrics, perform your identity for invisible audiences. You discipline yourself, all without anyone forcing you, because you want the likes, the followers, the engagement, the validation. That's disciplinary power at scale. Calories burned, heart rate monitored, sleep quantified, fertility tracked, genetic data analyzed. All this information fed back to you as knowledge about yourself. Norms about what's healthy, optimal, normal. Insurance companies want your data. Employers offer wellness programs. States track public health through digital surveillance, contact tracing, vaccine passports, mobility patterns, all in the name of managing populations, protecting life. But who decides what counts as life worth protecting? Which populations matter? Which can be sacrificed? Foucault warned about state racism, how biopower's logic of fostering life requires identifying threats to the population. The abnormal, the deviant, the diseased, the dangerous, those who must be eliminated to protect the whole. Genocide isn't a departure from biopower. It's biopower taken to its extreme. When the dream of optimizing the population becomes a nightmare of purifying it. Whose autonomy matters, all wrapped in technical expertise, cost-benefit analysis, risk assessment, evidence-based policy. But Foucault teaches us to ask, what knowledge counts as evidence? Who produces it? What interests does it serve? What alternatives does it exclude? What norms does it enforce? What subjects does it create? To denaturalize what seems inevitable, to politicize what seems technical, to show that every claim about what's normal, what's healthy, what's optimal, what's efficient, is a claim about power, about who gets to decide, about whose life matters, about what kind of society we're building, often without realizing it, often while thinking we're just being rational, scientific, objective. But there's no view from nowhere. Every knowledge is situated, every norm is contested, every system of power produces resistance. Or do we refuse? Do we experiment? Do we create? Do we resist not by opposing power directly, but by living otherwise? By practicing different ways of being? By inventing new forms of relationship, pleasure, truth, freedom? Not freedom as the absence of power, that's impossible. But freedom is the capacity to transform power relations, to refuse certain forms of subjection, to create new possibilities. Not following rules someone else made, but making rules for yourself. Practices of self-cultivation, care of the self. Not narcissistic self-absorption, but deliberate shaping of how you live, how you relate to yourself, and to others, to authority, to truth. Ancient philosophers understood this. They had techniques, exercises, meditations, examinations of conscience, not to discover your true nature, but to create yourself as a work of art. Christianity transformed this into renunciation. Modern psychology transformed it into therapy, confessional truth-seeking. But Foucault sees another path: ethics as aesthetics, life as creative practice, the self as perpetual invention. Refusing certain norms means creating spaces where others can refuse them too. Experimenting with new ways of living means building communities of experimentation. Resistance is always collective, even when it starts with individual refusal. Foucault knew this. His activism proved it. Theory and practice together, analysis and resistance, understanding power to fight it better. In 2009, 25 years after his death, scholars compiled and published his lecture series, Security, Territory, Population, from 1977 to 78. In these lectures, Foucault explicitly traced how European states in the 18th century developed new rationalities of government, new ways of thinking about how to rule, not just by law and sovereignty, but by managing populations, fostering life, maximizing utility. This required new knowledge, statistics to measure populations, economics to understand markets, medical science to track disease. All these developed together, not by conspiracy, but through the practical problems of governing. Once you see population as an object to be managed, you need to know about it. Birth rates, death rates, fertility, mortality, disease patterns, economic productivity. All this information becomes power. Power to intervene, to regulate, to optimize. And the more you intervene, the more you normalize. The more you create categories of normal and abnormal, healthy and unhealthy, productive and unproductive. These categories shape how people see themselves, how they regulate themselves. The cycle reinforces itself. Population management produces subjects who manage themselves, who accept management as natural, necessary, beneficial. That's how thoroughly it succeeded, how completely it's captured not just your body but your desires, your aspirations, your sense of what a good life means, its contradictions, its openings. Foucault called this genealogy a history of the present, not studying the past for its own sake, but studying how the past produced the present, to show the present could be otherwise, to make change thinkable, possible, not guaranteed, never guaranteed, but possible. But because he gave us ways to analyze any configuration of power, any set of norms, any system of knowledge, you can take his questions and ask them about anything: your workplace, your family, your school, your church, your political system, your intimate relationships. What norms operate here? How are they constructed? Who benefits from them? What alternatives are suppressed? What subjects do they produce? What forms of resistance do they enable? These questions have no final answers. But asking them is already a form of resistance, already a refusal to accept things as natural, inevitable, beyond question. Because power isn't a thing you possess. It's a relation you enact, and relations can be contested, reversed, transformed. Every act of power creates the possibility of counterconduct, refusal, subversion. Not easily, not without cost, but possible. Always possible. The disciplined worker who slows down, the normalized student who fails deliberately, the medicalized patient who refuses treatment, the confessing subject who lies, the surveilled body that disappears, the categorized person who rejects the category. These small acts matter. They create cracks, openings, spaces where power falters, and where new possibilities emerge. Nothing inevitable. The state responded with force, concessions, recuperation, life returned to normal. But something changed. People had seen that normal wasn't inevitable, that power could be challenged, that another world was possible, if only briefly. Foucault carried that with him, that sense of possibility, that memory of rupture. His work tries to keep that space open, to prevent closure, to resist the return to inevitability. We need that now more than ever, as systems of control become more sophisticated, more invisible, more internalized, as power operates through algorithms nobody understands, through platforms nobody controls, through data nobody owns, as surveillance becomes total but feels like convenience, as normalization becomes absolute but presents as personalization, as biopower manages populations through crises real and manufactured. As states use health emergencies to justify permanent surveillance, borders to justify permanent exclusion, security to justify permanent war, we need tools to analyze this, to resist it, to imagine alternatives. Foucault provides those tools, not complete, not infallible, but necessary. He made visible the invisible, questioned the unquestionable, historicized the natural, politicized the technical, denaturalized the present, opened the future, not by predicting it, but by showing how it could be different, how it had to be different. Because the present is unbearable, not obviously, not theatrically, but quietly, thoroughly, Totally. In ways we've learned not to see, in ways we've been taught to accept. In ways we've internalized so completely we think they're natural, our own, inevitable. They have been otherwise, they will be otherwise. If we make them so, not easily, not by wishing, but by understanding, by analyzing, by refusing, by experimenting, by creating, by practicing freedom as the art of not being governed quite so much. In that way, by those means, at that price. Discovered in archives Foucault never saw, published in research he never read, but confirming his deepest insight, the insight that unified his work. In 2022, historians examining 18th century French administrative documents found detailed records of how disciplinary institutions coordinated their operations, schools, hospitals, prisons, factories, all sharing information, standardizing procedures. Synchronizing their techniques, not through conspiracy, through the simple logic of administrative efficiency, each institution produced knowledge about its subjects, each developed methods of control, each faced similar problems, so they learned from each other, copied innovations, built on successes, created networks of power knowledge that spread throughout society, without anyone planning it, without anyone directing it. Just the accumulation of practical solutions to practical problems. The result was a system, comprehensive, coordinated, and visible, a system that shaped bodies and souls more thoroughly than any sovereign ever could, that produced subjects more docile than any torture could achieve, that normalized life more completely than any law could enforce, and nobody noticed, because it looked like progress, like civilization, like care, like freedom. That's the genius of modern power. That's what Foucault saw. That's what he showed us. That's what we still need to understand. If we want to resist it, if we want to live otherwise, if we want to be free.